In 1846, near a border traced by a river, two neighbors went to war. The fighting between the United States and Mexico began near the Rio Grande, then raged deep into the heart of the Mexican nation. From the shores of the Pacific to the Gulf Coast of Veracruz, to the final assault on the halls of Montezuma, Mexico City itself. In the end, Mexico was stripped of nearly half of its territory. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, land that transformed the United States into a continental power reaching from sea to sea. This is the story of a war that reshaped a continent and forged a new identity for its people. A war that caused wounds that have yet to heal. The war between the United States of America and Mexico. The Mexican War is the first time the United States successfully invaded a foreign country, maintained a sustained major series of campaigns in that country, and eventually occupied that country's capital. It is the first time that the U.S. used war correspondents that actually reported from the front lines the characters and the events of the war to the American general public. It is the first time photography was ever used to capture some of the images of the soldiers and the climate of the war. Lastly, the Mexican War is also one of the first wars in which there was a great aftermath of writing and reminiscence about the war that was made available to the general public. The Mexican War was rooted in a number of causes, the most central being the issue of Texas. For years, the colonists there managed their own affairs, but in 1835, the Mexican Congress abolished most of the states' rights and centralized power in Mexico City under President Antonio López de Santa Anna. The move triggered a series of revolts across the country, one of which stands out in our minds.
You will remember this battle! Remember the Alamo!
While Texas lost the Alamo, it won its independence from Mexico in 1836 and had been an independent republic for a decade. The issue of the annexation of Texas to the United States was the biggest cause of the Mexican War. Mexican officials still regarded Texas as a province inside the Mexican Republic. The province was occupied by Americans and in rebellion. Nonetheless, it was a province that would be reconquered eventually. The immediate trigger that set off the war was the argument over the Mexican-Texas boundary. The United States recognized the Rio Grande as the border of Texas. Even though it did not recognize the independence of Texas, Mexico declared that the Nueces River to the north was the boundary. It was in this no-man's land that Texas and Mexico struggled for possession. James K. Polk ran for the presidency in 1844 with Manifest Destiny as the bedrock of his campaign platform. The term Manifest Destiny was coined by expansionists in the 1840s, coinciding with the movement west. The idea behind Manifest Destiny was that God commanded it for his chosen people. Polk was determined to acquire Oregon, Texas, and California. While the United States was looking to expand, Mexico was barely holding itself together. With 14 presidents between 1824 and 1844, Mexico was experiencing political chaos. The Mexicans had always maintained that the mere annexation of Texas would be cause enough to declare war. The Americans took the Mexicans at their word. General Zachary Taylor was sent down with a small American army. With a nickname like Old Rough and Ready, and as a hero of the War of 1812, Taylor had an impressive military resume. Nonetheless, he was a common man, a citizen soldier that the people admired. Taylor established the Army of Observation, which was supposed to basically raise the American flag and wait to see what happened. However, according to some sources, President Polk did not intend to start a war. He genuinely believed that it was possible to negotiate a treaty. Special emissary John Slidell was authorized to pay over $3 million to the Mexicans to resolve the boundary dispute at the Rio Grande. He was also authorized to pay another $30 million for California and New Mexico. The Mexican officials were outraged and declared that any Mexican government that even considered the offer should be overthrown. Polk considered declaring war at this time, but his advisors told him to let the Mexicans make the first move. Instead, Polk instructs Taylor to move further south. Taylor marches to the Rio Grande and establishes Fort Texas just across the river from the Mexican border town of Matamoros. On the north side of the river, the Mexicans ambushed 63 American dragoons. In his war message to Congress, Polk says that American blood was spilled on American soil. Nonetheless, Polk had a difficult time getting his message across to Congress. There were too many issues going on at the time, including national expansion, slavery, and the morality of going to war with our southern neighbor. Many did not like the idea of expansion because they thought it would only advocate slavery. Slavery as an institution had to expand to survive. The greatest support for the war against Mexico and territorial acquisition was in the South. Nonetheless, war fever gripped the nation, quelling any significant dissent. Before Polk even declared war, the major battles of the war had already commenced: Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. The fact that these battles were brilliant American victories only assisted Polk in his push for war. Congress declared war on May 13, 1846. There was overwhelming support for the conflict throughout the nation. Thousands of young American men enlisted to take part in nationalism and adventure. American forces penetrated further into northern Mexico. From the border town of Matamoros to the mountains near Buena Vista, Zachary Taylor led his men to impressive victories that made him a hero and laid the groundwork for his future presidency. History tends to view this war as one in which a strong United States went down and beat up on a pitifully weak Mexico. However, the reality was quite different. In every major battle of the Mexican War, Mexico held alarming numerical superiority. The Americans had to rely on their superior weaponry, training, and leadership. Their light artillery was the backbone of their success. The Mexican army was antiquated. Leaders were bought or inherited their titles. They were overstaffed, undersupplied, and poorly trained. Monterrey was one of the largest cities in northern Mexico, as well as a strategic point leading into the Mexican interior. Taking Monterrey meant controlling the road that went into Mexico City. Marching to Monterrey exposed Americans to the real enemy. The Mexican terrain came fully equipped with dysentery and yellow fever, which killed more American soldiers than the Mexican army. In Monterrey, from September 20th to 24th, Taylor and his men would see some of the most intense combat of the war. Taylor allowed himself to be talked into an armistice that did not have the backing of the U.S. government. This agreement allowed the Mexican army to escape. Therefore, Taylor had nothing to show for all of the American casualties except the city of Monterrey. In addition, President Polk wanted to replace Taylor because he was getting such positive press. He was ordered to stop his campaign and remain in Monterey. Meanwhile, a decisive naval battle would give way to a short overland campaign commenced from Veracruz to Mexico City. General Winfield Scott was to lead this new campaign, and he ordered the best of Taylor's men to Veracruz. Taylor was left near Buena Vista with approximately 5,000 volunteers. Mexican General Santa Anna learned of the change in strategy and decided to attack Taylor's weakened regiment. The stage was set for Taylor's greatest victory, the Battle of Buena Vista, on February 22nd through 23rd, 1847. This battle began as a Mexican victory because Santa Anna assembled a force far larger than the American army. However, American artillery proved decisive in shattering Mexican assaults. Buena Vista turned out to be a great American victory that virtually demolished the army that Santa Anna had assembled on the northern frontier. While Taylor was winning his victory, President Polk sent General Stephen W. Kearny and the Army of the West to occupy California and New Mexico. By 1847, these coveted territories were under American control. Nevertheless, the war continued. It had to be ended by either military means or by negotiations. No Mexican government could politically negotiate with the Americans. Consequently, the war waged on. The Napoleonic mindset of the time called for the occupation of the enemy's capital, thus setting up Scott's great campaign. Winfield Scott was called Old Fuss and Feathers. He was a large man with an ego to match, but very professional. Many military historians consider Scott's campaign against Mexico City to be the best of any American general. Never has a general accomplished more, with fewer men, under harder conditions, and with less support from his government. Scott's campaign began at Veracruz in March of 1847. He landed an army of about 10,000, which in itself was a significant military feat. Instead of taking it by storm, he bombed the city into submission. From the Mexican point of view, this victory would have been less impressive because the city's population was comprised mostly of civilians. As Scott moved into the interior of Mexico, his lines were threatened by Mexican guerrillas. They attacked stragglers. American soldiers would often find the mutilated remains of their comrades with their hearts cut out and their tongues hanging on trees over the mutilated bodies. Almost as unforgiving as the guerrillas was the Mexican interior, which included mountains and dense jungles perfect for ambushes. Such was the case on April 17th through 18th at Sierra Gorda, the first major battle of Scott's campaign. While defending a mountain pass, Mexican General Santa Anna was defeated by storming American forces. After this victory, Scott had to make a difficult decision. Either press on to Mexico City before the arrival of promised reinforcements, or wait and risk being a sitting target for disease and the Mexican army. Scott decides to gamble it all on the capital. On September 8th, Scott was victorious at Molina del Rey. Now, only the fortified heights of Chapultepec Castle, the National Military School, stood between Scott and Mexico City. This is a great moment of pride and honor for the Mexican soldier to have to defend his national capital. It is the first time the capital had been threatened since Hernan Cortez. The Battle of Chapultepec on September 13th would be the last and most important battle of the war. If the Mexican War is considered a preview of the Civil War, then Chapultepec foreshadowed the Battle of Gettysburg. On September 14th, General Scott entered Mexico City with his army of 6,000 men. The war was over, but there was no one to make peace. Nicholas Trist, the negotiator, had traveled with the general, but he had no one to negotiate with. Santa Anna had fled the country. The search for someone to sign away on the conquest of northern Mexico continued. During this period in the U.S., a new debate arose regarding how much of Mexico should be taken. The All Mexico movement in Congress desired all Mexican lands. However, this would have meant subjugating the whole of Mexico and possibly 10 more years of fighting. On the surface, the movement failed because President Polk decided that he had all that he wanted of Mexico. Another possible reason that it failed was because of Mexican racism. The Mexicans were an alien, non-English speaking people with different social and religious institutions. There was befuddlement as to how they should be governed. The All Mexico movement did succeed in that it forced Mexican officials to the peace table. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. By the terms of the treaty, the Rio Grande became the southern border of Texas. New Mexico and California were acquired by the United States, and the United States would pay Mexico $15 million for the land. The war resulted in something called by historians national war guilt. In the U.S., an enormous debate erupted over the treaty. According to those who opposed it, it was far too generous. They didn't want to pay anything for territory they had gained fair and square. Whether it was due to guilt or adherence to President Polk's initial gains, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified by the Senate on March 10th. With that, one of the most controversial conflicts in American history was over. On the side of Mexico, the war brought national unity and a true sense of nationalism to the country. It brought them into the 20th century by causing them to consider modernization and forcing them into reforming the government. On the side of the U.S., gaining the territories of Utah, Nevada, California, New Mexico, and Arizona, the U.S. became a continental nation. But the war had other, perhaps ironic, consequences. The United States would pay a terrible price for waging this aggressive war. The territory was conquered, but now the Americans began to argue over what to do with it, principally whether it was to be slave or free. Eventually, a great compromise in 1850 would settle some of these questions, but not the major question. The conquest of territory in the Mexican War was the essential ingredient that helped bring about the American Civil War. The poison that seeped into the American body politic would eventually destroy the Union and lead to the deaths of 600,000 young American men. Indeed, no dollar amount can be put on the conquest of the West. If the Mexican War is remembered at all, it is known as the conflict in which the United States fulfilled its manifest destiny and became a continental nation. Yet, in spite of its impact on American history, the Mexican War has been ignored by most people. However, it's an intriguing story, born out of controversy and full of heroes and scoundrels, high drama and low comedy, exotic location, and an ending that in some ways is still being written. Whether it was a land grab at gunpoint or a justified military action, the Mexican War will always spark debate. But at least one conclusion can be drawn. The sacrifice, courage, and honor displayed by U.S. and Mexican soldiers should be remembered as the down payment on the price paid for the American West.